This undivided substance of absolute freedom ascends the throne of the world without any power being able to resist it. For since in truth consciousness alone is the element in which the spiritual beings or powers have their substance, their entire system, which is organized and maintained by division into masses or spheres, has collapsed. Now that the individual consciousness conceives the object as having no other essence than self-consciousness itself, or as being absolutely notion. What made the notion into an existent object was its diremption into separate subsistent spheres. But when the object becomes a notion, there is no longer anything in it with a continuing existence. Negativity has permeated all its moments. It comes into existence in such a way that each individual consciousness raises itself out of its allotted sphere, no longer finds its essence and its work in this particular sphere, but grasps itself as the notion of will, grasps all spheres as the essence of this will, and therefore can only realize itself in a work which is a work of the whole. In this absolute freedom, therefore, all social groups or classes, which are the spiritual spheres into which the whole is articulated, are abolished. The individual consciousness that belonged to any such sphere and willed and fulfilled itself in it has put aside its limitation. Its purpose is the general purpose, its language universal law, its work the universal work. Paragraph 585 continues Hegel's examination of this notion, and I do mean notion both in the broader sense that we typically use it, and in the very specific sense, the Begriff that Hegel has in mind, the notion of will, and in particular that of the general will and the relationship of the individual to the general will within a society, within, in particular, here, French society of leading up to the Revolution and through the Revolution brought about by the Enlightenment. So this idea, this concept of general will, here he's going to talk about that in terms of the substance of absolute freedom, the absolute freedom of the title of this very section, right? That is what is being explored here. How does this permeate the society? How does it transform it? And we can talk in terms of real changes, that is, changes that are observable, that impact the wirklich, the actual. And we can also talk in terms of ideal changes as well, and these don't always map onto each other. So we want to keep that in mind as we're reading about these transformations that are taking place within this section. So let's take a look at the text. He tells us, this undivided substance of absolute freedom ascends the throne of the world without any power being able to resist it. So now we have something that stands out as similar to the Lord of the world in the earlier discussions that we saw in both the reason section and in the self-consciousness section. Also, it came up again in the spirit section earlier on. And nothing is able to oppose it. Why is nothing able to oppose it? Because anything opposing it in the name of some sort of universality is really opposing it as a particularity opposed to the universal. So let's jump ahead a little bit and then we'll come back to the text. Hegel here is contrasting this absolute freedom, the general will, against all of the, as he's going to call it in this section, spiritual beings and powers, or as he called it just earlier, and again reaffirms in this section, spiritual masses or spheres, domains, areas, estates, whatever we want to call them, factions perhaps within a society. Every single one of them in a way, has a sort of universality to it. It presents itself, at least to those who belong to it, as if it is somehow absolutely central. The tasks that it is occupied with, the values that it is preoccupied with and trying to realize, those should matter to everybody. And we get a kind of myopia, a kind of blindsidedness quite often that occurs with this. So a doctor, for example, working in his hospital, thinks that healing people is the most important thing and everything else should be subservient to that. The engineer working in her context believes that the product that she is designing and perhaps even expanding the range of human activity through, that's the most important thing. The person in charge of education, if you've ever been to a college, professors and administrators think that they're doing the most important thing in the world. And everybody does this. So everybody is bringing some sort of, not necessarily universalizable, but at least pretending to be universal in importance, in essence, in the Wesen, wesentlich, what is really most essential. They're all trying to claim that. And we saw that this leads to all sorts of conflicts between these different, let's call them social forces, or representatives of social groups, classes, dynamics. They're always revealed as not being as universal as they would like to pretend to be. What is universal? The general will, the absolute substance in this case. So Hegel goes on and he says, in truth, consciousness alone is the element in which these spiritual beings or powers have their substance. And he talks about an entire system organized and maintained by division into masses or spheres as having collapsed. Now, has it collapsed in actuality? Does this mean that we have attained the classless society and perhaps even a moneyless society where nothing there's no difference between anybody and we're all just part of this big general will? No, that's not the case. In actuality, these social classes, these articulated, organized parts of a system still are there in place. There have been attempts to try to get away from that. One particularly interesting one that comes to mind for me is when the Chinese military attempted for a very brief experiment to get rid of ranks and to fight against, in this case, the Vietnamese, with units that didn't actually have leaders. It went terrible. You do, in fact, need some sort of structure. But ideally, what does that mean? Ideally, in the realm of the mind, which doesn't just include, each person isolated by themselves. In the world of ideas, and ideas are public by this point, this distinction has been abolished. This is a very important point. How does it get abolished? Well, because consciousness permeates all of this, all of these spiritual masses and spheres. Something may have been done according to tradition, according to routine, according to the SOP, standard operating procedures, for a long time. And then somebody comes along and says, well, wait a second, why are we doing it that way? Why does this person just sit over there stamping things on their desk, and this guy busts his butt over here working to make up for what this person over here isn't doing? These are inefficient. What's going on here? This is part of what happens during the French Revolution, and indeed other revolutions as well. It's also what happens when we're engaged in what we call, these days, innovation or disruption, right? Something, consciousness permeates a system that's already in place, and the individuals who are part of it start saying, well, wait a second, why don't I get a voice? Why are you the one who decides the way the institutional culture goes, Maybe we should be using this operating system instead of this antiquated one that you have. Maybe these fillable forms that you have are actually crap, which turns out to be the case quite often. Let's make some new fillable forms and let's actually rethink what we're doing with them so that the things that the data that people are entering actually goes somewhere and makes sense. All of that is along the lines of what Hegel is talking about here. All of that is not only real transformation, but ideal transformation. So going back to the text, he says, this entire system, which is organized and maintained by division into masses or spheres, has collapsed now that the individual consciousness conceives the object as having no other essence than self-consciousness itself, or as being absolutely notion. And, being absolutely notion means that there's a sort of comprehensive grasp, right, of one's own involvement in it. What does all this talk mean? It means that these individuals down here start to become demystified about the nature and the importance of these spiritual masses. They start saying, wait a second, I have a stake. I matter in this because I am part of this general will. I represent this general will better than the people running these spheres do. They're just motivated by particular interests or ideologies or old ways of doing things, habits, you might say, on an institutional scale. People start saying, why don't we put this to a vote? Why don't we try this? Why don't we change who is in charge? All right, so Hegel says, there's a little bit of metaphysics here. We could call it metaphysics of society. What made the notion into an existent object was its diremption into separate subsistent spheres, but when the object becomes a notion, there's no longer anything in it with a continuing existence. Negativity has permeated all of its moments. What does this mean to say negativity has permeated all of its moments? This means that the moments still do exist. The spiritual masses and spheres still are there. But at every place, there's somebody who could critique, who could say, wait a second, this isn't right. This needs to change. They could also say, oh, this is really wonderful. We should do more and more of this. Although that's less often the case when critique is going on, isn't it? And so Hegel here is mapping, you could say, the development of consciousness through the notion onto the transformations of society. Now we're starting to see real transformations where only ideal transformations were taking place. He says, it comes, now what's the it here? The notion. It comes into existence in such a way that each individual consciousness raises itself out of its allotted sphere, no longer finds its essence and work in this particular sphere, but grasps itself as the notion of will. So why do I have this sort of three-part schema here? Substance, absolute freedom, the general will at the top, individuals down below, spiritual masses and spheres mediating in between. Well, because in the past, these spiritual masses or spheres or powers, whatever you want to call them, were indeed mediating for the individuals who were members of those, who were part of its fabric. But each of those individuals is a human being, a consciousness, a rational self-consciousness, at least in possibility. Some people may be so broken, so beaten down that they can't conceive of themselves as anything other than a cog in the wheel or as a part of this particular estate. I'm only a peasant. I till the field, I keep my mouth shut and my head down, and that's that. Or I am a noble. I continue on my family's line, manage the estate, show up to war when called upon, go to events that hopefully at least maintain, if not increase, my social status, and try not to be ruined by all the creditors hounding me. And we could go on and on and on. People often conceive of themselves as just what they are within the context of their social role, which is given to them as part of this spiritual sphere. They belong to this. I am a university professor. I am only here to transmit the wisdom of the ages, or to pick another mission to open up new minds to old vistas, or to revolutionize the masses by unmasking the ideology. Pick whatever you like. So long as you're thinking of yourself as just what you are with in relation to your sphere, you're not really thinking of yourself as a full, free consciousness. And what is the notion that allows us to break through that? It's the notion of will, the notion of choice, the notion of self-determination. And as we saw in the previous paragraph, this is intimately connected with the concept of personality. So, insofar as each individual, and I'm just picking on one individual here, grasps itself through the notion of will, it grasps itself as something that transcends the state, the class, the race, whatever it happens to be that it's divided into. And when I say it, I mean the totality of the society. The individual is not divided. The individual is subsumed into that. But insofar as they grasp themselves through this notion of will, not just as their own will, but as the general will, they transcend that. So he says, it grasps itself as the notion of will, grasps all spheres as the essence of this will, and therefore can only realize itself in a work which is a work of the whole. So you still do remain the factory worker, part of this group. You still do remain the manager. You still do remain the high school teacher. You still do remain the subway train conductor or janitor, or pick whatever you like. But now your work is contributing to the totality, in part because the spiritual mass that you belong to is itself supposed to be contributing to the totality. Something that's being left off here, well, wait a second, what if your spiritual mass, the one that you belong to, is not really contributing to the totality? What if instead it is parasitical? It is drawing upon the resources of the totality and enjoying them and consuming them, but not really giving anything back, even though it might be saying that it's giving something back. Was that the case in the French Revolution? It certainly was. For those who don't know, the French Revolution takes place essentially as a bourgeois, but also harnessing the people in certain areas, a bourgeois revolution against the upper classes. And what were the upper or privileged classes in that case? Of course, you have the king at the top, but the king is really his own thing. And he's also then surrounded by a whole bunch of courtiers. But then you've got the nobles. And the nobles have become part of this courtier class. Why? Because otherwise they're too prone to engage in rebellion. So, Louis XIV, for example, concentrates his court by bringing the nobles out of their demences and saying, you have to attend court, right? And then we've also got the second estate, the clergy. And some of the clergy are dirt poor, right? The people who are parish priests, just making it, ministering to people. But we've got the whole strata of society of people who are, quite rich. And this still goes on within pretty much every religious organization you can find today, because it goes on within pretty much any organization you can find today. It's not a uniquely religious thing. Now, what is it that the nobles are supposed to be contributing? Are they merely supposed to be ornaments in the crown of the king? That doesn't seem like a very good reason to throw a ton of money at them, does it? Or resources, or time, or privileges. What are the nobles actually good for? In the past, the understanding was the nobles become the nobles precisely because in time of war, they're supposed to be called upon to lead and to fight and to save the nation. And, in the past, quite often that did occur. It's worth mentioning as well that around the time of the French Revolution, we often have this really silly caricature of the French because of World War II. We're like, they're so weak. They lost, against the Nazis. They couldn't really fight. We had to come in and save them. And then we had to do the same thing in Vietnam, although we don't talk that much about that because we also lost in Vietnam as well. At this point in time, the French were really the holy terror of Europe. I mean, the other really dangerous element in the centuries before that was the Spanish, of course, right? And the Germans were seen as kind of a weak group, up until the time after the Napoleonic Wars. That's a little bit of a side note. So the nobles were supposed to be contributing in some way, but they don't actually contribute. Who's doing the main fighting in modern warfare? And we are talking about modern warfare in the 1700s. There are officers leading, but it's primarily masses of troops shooting at each other. Artillerymen, cavalry. The nobles have really outworn their use. They no longer contribute to the society. What about the clergy? The traditional division within medieval society was the peasants cultivate the land and produce food. The nobles protect. And what do the priests do? They pray. Priests, monks, nuns. They provide guidance. They were the first teachers in many respects. They're the ones who kept Western civilization in its literate form alive at a time during what we call the Dark Ages, which were, just a few centuries, everyone else was losing it in the West. Do they really serve that purpose anymore? Do you need people praying for you? Or is that a matter of superstition that the Enlightenment now has cast aside? Do you need them teaching? Don't you already have other people doing that? We could also ask about the administrative bureaucracy. The French distinguished between the noblesse d'épée, the nobles of the sword, and the noblesse de la robe, what we might call bureaucratic nobility. Those who serve the king and the instrumentalities of the kingdom by pushing papers, by exercising judgment, by making decisions. They will be retained. Those are still serving a very vital purpose. So during the French Revolution, if we're thinking about Hegel's discussion here, each of these spiritual masses or spheres is supposed to be in a non-parasitical but rather productive, contributory way, making its own, share of the general will. So institutions or organizations or people who are not contributing are going to be sloughed off. This is a prefiguration of the terror. Let's come back to the text now. So he says, it grasps all the spheres as the essence of this will and therefore can only realize itself in a work which is a work of the whole. And he goes on and he says, in this absolute freedom, therefore, all social groups or classes, which are the spiritual spheres into which the whole is articulated, are abolished. Now, are they abolished in reality? Only much, much later, and they're never truly abolished because you can't completely overcome differentiation. But they are abolished in, you might say, in the realm of ideas, by proclaiming, for example, the equality of all people. Although the French, of course, did say all men before the law, or, in proclaiming that education would henceforth for men, this is why Mary Wollstonecraft wrote her Vindication of the Rights of Women, the total side topic there, but worth noting, all men would receive a free public education. Sort of a leveling of the playing field, ideally. Not in actuality, not completely in actuality, we should say, but ideally. So these spheres are being abolished insofar as their importance lies in this schema. So he says the individual consciousness that belong to any such sphere is also being abolished. So if you think of yourself as just a candlestick maker, or just a servant, or just a bureaucratic functionary, or whatever it happens to be, I'm just this, then you're going to be left behind. You have to be somehow connected to this general will, and that is through the notion of will. So Hegel closes this paragraph in a very interesting way by saying the individual consciousness that belonged to any sphere and willed and fulfilled itself in it has now put aside this limitation. Candlestick makers become conscious of themselves as members of the nation, as in some sense equal to the nobles, equal to the judges, equal to the clergy, equal to whoever has enjoyed the privileges up until this point. Notice how he brings us to an end here. Its purpose. What's purpose? The purpose of the individual who's become conscious in this sense. Its purpose is the general purpose. Its language, universal law. Its work, the universal work. So there's a kind of overcoming of particularity, not happening through these, but happening at the level of the individual by becoming identified with, by becoming a part of the substance of absolute freedom, the general will.